Hello, Peanut Peeps. How you doing? I'm doing great. Today's episode, I want to talk about how I expose for video. I'm just showing you how I do it. You may do it differently, but for someone who's just starting with video, this may help. Okay, what am I actually trying to expose? So when I'm watching a movie, my eye is drawn to the actors' faces. This applies to birds too. Your eye is drawn to the bird's face and eyes to see if it's sharp. And if it's exposed properly, you'll be able to see all of the details. So in this episode, when I say it's dark or light, I'm referring to the subject of the scene, and that would be the wildlife. And I'm not exposing the whole scene, but really just the subject. In a movie, lights are placed to light up the subjects. But in wildlife, I only use natural light. So when they place lights for actors, it shines towards their faces. Same with wildlife. The best time to get light shining towards the face is usually the first and last 3 hours of the day. So when the sun is overhead, the light is on top of their head. This does not illuminate the face, so it may be difficult to get good exposure during that time. When you have good sunlight, besides exposing the subject well, it provides dramatic moods and really looks great cinematically. But on overcast or cloudy days, it's an even light, which allows you to film all day. But you may lose a little mood, but on those days, I look for birds in action, like feeding, and things you normally don't see. Both types of light has its advantage. There are fixed settings, which I don't touch during filming, and there are settings that I will change depending upon what look I want, or I'll change it because of the light I have available. Okay, let's cover the fixed settings that I don't change. First thing is that I'll set the camera to manual. The next thing, I'll always have auto ISO on. To shoot in manual mode, hold down the mode button and rotate the main command dial or rear dial. The settings that I do change: number 1, shutter speed; 2, aperture; 3, exposure compensation. Now, shutter, aperture, and exposure compensation, I use these controls to create my look and exposure. Before I go further, I want to talk about how auto ISO works. What auto ISO does is that the camera looks at the scene and determines what the correct exposure is. So when you're panning into different lighting situations, the camera is calculating and changing the ISO accordingly. So do you always like the way auto ISO exposed the scene for you? Sometimes, but not always. But it puts you in the ballpark. And I'll explain later how I change the exposure. To enable auto ISO, press and hold the ISO button and rotate the front dial. Okay, now let's talk about the shutter speed and what that should be set to. The shutter speed should be set to minimally 2 times the frame rate. So if I'm shooting 4K 120 frames, the shutter speed will calculate to be 240. So in camera, you would set it to at least 250 because that's the closest to 240 that's available on the Z9. Do I change that number? Yes, but I'll talk about this later. And remember, when you raise the shutter speed, less light will hit the sensor, so your ISO will rise by that amount. For example, if you double the shutter speed, your ISO will also double. You can change the shutter speed by rotating the rear dial. Next is aperture. You can set this to whatever look you like, but keep in mind, the lower the number, the more light you'll have available. So if your lens is a 6:3 lens like the 800PF, 6:3 will allow the most light to the sensor, therefore giving you the lowest ISO. As you close the aperture or raise the number, the ISO will rise because of less light getting to the sensor. So for each stop you raise aperture, for example f8 to f11, this will double your ISO. To change aperture, rotate the front dial. Also, I use matrix metering. So it's calculating exposure on a wide area of the frame for results close to what is seen by the naked eye. So it's not exposing the subject, but that's what we'll do. And I'll show you examples on how we'll change the exposure quickly while filming. So with all that said, this is how we change the exposure. I use exposure compensation. If you want to make it darker, you'll reduce exposure compensation. And if you want to make it brighter, you raise exposure compensation. Just remember, when you raise exposure compensation, ISO goes up. And when you make it darker, ISO will go down. To change exposure compensation, press and hold the exposure compensation button and rotate the rear dial. While filming, I'm always ready to change exposure compensation. When you hold down the exposure compensation button, you'll see the plus minus turn yellow and you'll see the value. When you release, you'll see the ISO value. So what tools do I use to see if the exposure is correct rather than just using my eye through the viewfinder? I'll turn on the zebra pattern. This will tell me when something is overexposed by putting a zebra pattern on areas that are potentially overexposed. To set up the zebra pattern, first I press the menu on the back of the camera. Then go to Custom Settings menu, select Video, select Zebra Pattern, then select Pattern Tone Range, select Highlights, then go down to Highlight Threshold and enter 255. According to the Nikon Video Manual, the zebra pattern will show on the brightest portion of the image if Highlights is selected. Selecting 255 as the highlight threshold will display zebra pattern only on areas that are potentially overexposed. So now let's go through some examples. Here's what I do in low light. Light that's around sunset, sunrise, or heavier clouds where you're trying to bring the ISO down. Usually, lower the ISO, the sharper it will look, with less grain. To keep ISO down, set the controls that allows the most light. Set the shutter at 2 times the frame rate, or 250, for 120 frames. Set aperture wide open, the lowest F number. I find below ISO 2000 to be fairly sharp and not having much grain. ISOs above 2500, I may begin to see grain. The amount varies depending upon how the footage was exposed. I usually don't use noise reduction on my footage, but if it's special to me, I'll use neat video software to help remove the noise. With exposure compensation set at 0, the subject looks dark to me. I'll raise exposure compensation until it looks good to me. In this example, one full stop looks good. Here I'm seeing a little zebra pattern on the white part of the face. To me, that means that spot is probably blown out, and I need to reduce exposure compensation to get rid of it. Just reducing it, 0.3, gets rid of the zebra pattern, and now it looks good. Here I want to emphasize the zebra pattern. As I raise exposure compensation, you can see the zebra pattern expanding. Our goal is to eliminate any zebra pattern and expose to what looks good to you. With good light, you don't have to worry about high ISOs. Depending upon the light, I'll usually set my shutter speed between 250 and 400. Often, I'm at 320 shutter speed. I find this to be a nice sweet spot. The shutter affects the motion, and a little faster shutter speed may help with stabilization. Just like with low light, expose to what looks good when looking through your viewfinder. Eliminate the zebra pattern for overblown areas that are on the subject. Use exposure compensation to do this. ISO 64 is the lowest allowed for video. Any reduction to exposure compensation will not make it darker because at ISO 64 it's unable to go lower. To make it darker, raise the shutter or close down the aperture to raise the ISO above 64. Then you can reduce exposure compensation to make it darker. This is about 45 minutes after sunrise, and the light looks great. I set the shutter speed to 320 and aperture at f8, but it looks a little dark to me. So I add exposure compensation, and after adding one full stop, it looks good to me. Sometimes when the sun hits the white parts of the subject, exposure compensation may need to be reduced to look better and to remove the zebra pattern. Here, I want to show that when you're at ISO 64 and I'm reducing exposure compensation, it does not get darker. In this example, it already looks dark enough, and you probably wouldn't do this in the field. But I want to show how you can make it even darker using exposure compensation. First, you have to raise the ISO off of the low ISO 64. You can accomplish this by raising the shutter and or raising the F number. Then, reducing the exposure compensation, you can see it got a little darker. This example is a back side lid. I want to expose the subject. It looks dark, so I'll raise exposure compensation to make the subject look lighter. Okay, that's it for today. I hope this helped. If you watch episodes 1 through 3, you're ready to get out there and start doing some video. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. See you next time. Peanut Tree Adventures.